Yeah, we're going to go ahead and wrap up all this with video 2 for February 6th or whatever. The only thing we're going to talk about is the Harlem Renaissance, and this is where we're going to end. The Harlem Renaissance here is a cultural explosion of black culture here in the 1920s. This is a direct result from the Great Migration. Because during the war and after the war in the 1910s and 20s, you're going to see this massive migration of African Americans leaving the South to come to the North to find jobs. But as a result, you also get a big cultural explosion here too. By 1920, about 20% of African Americans are living in areas up north now. And the Great Migration continues to happen throughout the 20s. It takes a break during the Great Depression, but it will return during the 1940s when jobs reopened during the war. And you can see a map of this here. I know the map's not great, but you can kind of see a map here where a lot of African Americans leave the South to go find work in these various jobs up north. And later, during World War II, they're going to also head west. But anyway, the Harlem Renaissance, let me take a step back. So when the African Americans are still traveling these cities, they're still facing discrimination. Like there's still housing discrimination, there's still job discrimination, but you are seeing African Americans living in communities like Harlem in New York. And even in spite of the discrimination, there's still a general improvement of their earnings and materials and the material standard of living. So African Americans, while still facing these issues, are still getting a slowly better life than what they had before. The largest African American community in the world at this point is going to become Harlem, New York. So Harlem is not a city; it's a district within New York itself. But Harlem becomes the biggest African American community in the world at this point, with over 200,000 people living in Harlem by 1930. And so because you have a lot of people moving there, you don't just have a lot of average people moving there, you also have a lot of artists and writers and musicians, singers who all come here. And so Harlem becomes this hotbed of African American culture that emerges here in the 1920s. So that's what the Harlem Renaissance is. The Harlem Renaissance is this birth of African American art, literature, and music that you never seen before. You never had an African American cultural movement happen in America before this point. So that's why this is so significant that you're going to have this happen. And you should read some of these people in English as well too. And so you're going to get the literature side of this as well. But this is a significant African American cultural event that takes place here in the 1920s. So the poets and musicians. Some poets that were famous from this are Countee Cullen, Langston Hughes, James W. Johnson, Claude McKay, Zora Neale Hurston. All these are famous writers and poets of this time period. Most of y'all probably read Langston Hughes. And the things they focus on have a wide range. They focus on African American history, from things of like bitterness and discrimination and slavery, all the way to hope and joy and feelings about the future and prosperity in the future and so on. So a wide array of things that they'll focus on. But the point is that they're writing about African American experiences and feelings and culture and so forth, and that's why this is so unique, because you haven't really seen this happen before, all in one location like in Harlem at this period. You also see the jazz age also becomes very popular with blacks and whites, like we mentioned before, and so a lot of famous black artists will also perform in Harlem as well. So Harlem is going to have famous musicians like Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, who Louis Armstrong comes from New Orleans, but it plays in Harlem, Bessie Smith. These artists are famous musicians that play in Harlem, and most famously they play at what's called the Cotton Club. That was probably the hottest venue there. But whites were also attracted to jazz music too, so you have whites and blacks come to Harlem, to places like the Cotton Club, to come listen to musicians like Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong and Bessie Smith, to expose to the latest sounds of jazz music in this time period. So all kinds of new expressions and exposures you have because of the Harlem Renaissance with art and literature and music and so forth. And then you also have, the last thing we're going to talk about and where we're going to wrap the video up is going to be Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey is going to be one of the unique individuals in this movement. Marcus Garvey was un-American. He was actually a Jamaican immigrant who came to America in the 19-teens. So Marcus Garvey comes to the United States during the 19-teens. He creates this organization called the United Negro Improvement Association, or the UNIA. So he creates the United Negro Improvement Association here in the 19-teens. He brings it to Harlem, New York, and the whole point of the UNIA is to basically promote black community, to make blacks be able to afford their own homes and afford their own businesses and be successful without white intervention. So the whole point of the UNIA was to make blacks more self-reliant, more self-sufficient, and not be so much dependent upon whites. So his big contribution is this development of a feeling of black nationalism, racial pride, and individualism. That's Marcus Garvey's, and this is him right here. This is his big contribution to the Harlem Renaissance. Is his influence with black nationalism, racial pride, individualism, and so on. That he's celebrating black culture, black history, in ways that people had never really done before. But also black separatism. He wanted the black community to be totally self-sufficient away from whites. He didn't want them to be at all reliant upon whites and have them do everything for themselves, including education and their jobs, everything. So he didn't want African Americans being reliant upon white culture. He also famously had what he called the Back to Africa movement. So he took this to an extreme. He believed in black separatism so much that he wanted to have African Americans relocate themselves out of America to Africa, have them create a new country in Africa, and have them all move there and live there and so forth. So he began this process of gathering funds. He actually began the process of making ships, what he was going to call the Black Star Line, to get them there. The ships never got purchased, but he was going to begin purchasing ships and raising money to do so to get African Americans there as well. But in the course of all this, he gets arrested for mail fraud, for misappropriating funds, and so he actually gets put in jail and deported eventually back to Jamaica. But his legacy that he leaves behind is that he does create this very self-aware black pride, black nationalism movement here in the 1920s amongst African Americans. And there were people like W.E.B. Du Bois who did not agree with his ideas about back to Africa and separatism, but they did believe in his ideas about racial pride and self-respect that he promoted. So that's his unique contribution here. So that's where third hour got. So we're all going to be starting tomorrow on the next slide. So let me know if you have any questions. But thank you for watching, and thank you for getting caught up.